What's up, you guys? It's Macaction coming at you with another reaction. Today we're doing facts about slavery never mentioned in school. In school, I don't know if we talk too much about slavery in general. What I do know is I didn't pay too much of attention in history, so that could be the reason I didn't hear too much about slavery. History was like something I wasn't interested in until I got a little older, right? And when it comes to wanting to know certain things so you can set the world straight, lacking that knowledge can kind of like mess with you a little bit. So if for anything other reason, I didn't really want to know history for any other reason but to have the knowledge to participate in the conversation and or help to set things straight, right? But still to this day, I don't know too much about it. But let's get right into it. By the way, it's by Thomas Sowell.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and
That makes perfect sense because no one had ships at this time. And most likely if you tried to go anywhere and take a slave, I mean, like you needed many people and we had no way to take lots of people across water, right, at this time. So slavery was literally amongst people who lived closer to you. I mean, that just makes sense logically. Obviously, I wouldn't know, but that's what it seems like it would be like, right?
transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. And the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted.
I mean, that's true. Slavery is like race is an ideology, but because tribes all look different, obviously, due to the way genetics work, right? If I take a wife and then I have bunches of kids and there's another family has bunches of kids and our families just keep like doing a thing, or this tribe is going to look like we're all going to look really similar and we're going to create a tribe that looks like most of us, right? And that's how genes work, right? So wherever you are, that tribe is going to look like that tribe. And the more you move towards another country, you can kind of see like a gradual shift in that look. Like they'll look like this over here and the shift in looks will change until you get there, right? Like in Africa, the closer they get to the Middle East, the more the African people look more like African / Middle Eastern, right? If you ever look at the detailed structure of their faces and stuff, it starts to change to look more like that. And then when you finally get to the Middle East, they look like that. Also the same way everywhere, right? America is really different because we just have our genetic diversity in America is just huge now, which is most likely a good thing for the human species, right? Genetic diversity is very good. I mean, I've heard scientifically, right? So, but yeah, let's continue.
The institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe.
Because the weird thing about slavery, when it comes to your tribe, you kind of don't want to enslave your tribe because you feel those people are close to you. Like you can sort of like give reasons to enslave people that aren't like you, right? So you get to the situation, and this is just all this is all just theoretical, you know. I sort of solved the problem within my brain. This is how I picture it. You have a tribe of people, and you don't want to be harsh to your own people. You consider them like-minded, your own kind. It's kind of like your family, right? Anybody that's not your family is sort of an outsider, and you would rather harm come to them than your family members, no matter how you think about it, right? That is just the truth. Unless you just hate your family, you rather harm come to someone else, even though you don't wish harm on anybody else because you're so moral. But you rather harm come to someone else than your family. That's just, facts. That's just how we live. And so if you got important things that need to do, you're like a leader and you're trying to make things happen. No workers, you don't want to force your people to work. It's better to go outside, even if it's immoral, I guess, to go get other people to do the work for you. Unless you can figure out a way to trade. If you have nothing to trade, then force, right?
The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million.
Wow.
The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical...
I know you guys remember them like making us watch that crap in class, right? It was so awkward. I guess it's only awkward because by the time that Roots was a thing that I was being taught or shown in school, I moved to a city that was predominantly white. And so it was a little awkward to like watch Roots and how blacks were, even though it was nature, like a nature documentary, sort of, it was portrayed in that film. Like I'm the only black dude in class surrounded by a bunch of white dudes. Like, look at your kind, it's kind of weird, but, and I didn't know the purpose. Was it to show people how harsh the reality of that time was? Or what was the reasoning for those movies to be shown in school? Right? I don't get it. Maybe that was the reason. That's the only reason I could see at this very moment. Maybe if I think on it long enough, I could figure something else out. But I didn't see the reason for them to be shown at that time. Somebody to let me know what was the big reason for that.
Accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history,
not real,
or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making."
Like why? Especially
despite the impression created by
those types of documentaries are being used in school to, and are thought to depict accuracy. Or did our schools know they weren't accurate? Because I don't remember a disclaimer ever being said. Obviously it was a long time ago, but of a teacher being like, this is not totally accurate, but, sort of. A lot of hyperbole and misinformation. I would like a world where, like, we can gather the truth, and the truth is the only thing taught. General consensus from across the world compiled into one truth is what's taught in school, historically speaking. I mean, about, when it comes to history and or science, today we have so many like just fabricated pieces of scientific research and pseudoscience, bias science. And, you go across the world of China, their science is different. Why? Let's get the top scientists to put together something that represents the most accurate version of the truth that we can come up with. And let's study and learn that so we could be a more smart species, right? Like, no one knows the truth. Like, only reason we argue about things today is because we don't know the truth. It's so weird. If somebody would just come down and be like, hey, it's truth. Here's all the information on how this is truth. Right?
Roots. During the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself.
I can see that.
The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people.
Right. Like, you couldn't just, the people who think that, Europeans were just taking slaves. I mean, it most likely came to a point when they got strong enough to do so, they were doing so. And when, the Africans got weak enough to, not have any counter to whatever they developed, like the minigun and all that stuff. But before that, like, there was no way for the Europeans to even assess the amount of the danger of the African army at that point, right? And to just even think about going over there to take people was just very dangerous and an unsophisticated plan, right? So you have to go assess the territory, see what they're about, see how weak they are, how strong they are, just so you can, kind of figure out how you would attack if you would. And before that, going there, they were met with resistance, right? There's people who guard the area. These people aren't just weak, right?
Willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis.
Suicide, man, like, are you braver when you commit suicide, right? Or, what's on your mind? Because the biggest human, trait, right? Or instinct is to survive and not die, or animals in general. And when people commit suicide to avoid capture, that's really huge when you think about it, right? Like, not some mentally ill person committing suicide, like, a regular sane person deciding that that's a better route must think that the evils being done to their people, or that situation is just 100 times more horrible, right?
Pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast.
Yeah, obviously.
It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before.
Like, you don't know every industry. It's like today, just regular stuff. We buy stuff, but we don't know the process of how they get it. We're ignorant to most processes that come before the purchase of the product we get, right? We don't understand how it's made, for the most part. Not too many people are just familiar with the processes before the purchase. And yeah, that's just it just sounds normal. Like when you get to the market, stuff's there for you to get, and that's all you know, and that's really pretty much all you're supposed to know, But yeah, I mean, that just makes sense.
The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners.
Yeah.
Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated one-third of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
I mean, it only makes sense, man. Like, you're a product of your society. Slavery is a big thing that's accepted by society, right? To fit in, that's what you're probably going to participate in, that kind of thing, right? It's just normal, even though no matter how immoral it is, and that's just like reality. Wherever you go, you're going to blend into society. And that's just how it works, man. You follow the rules of the game, because most people are just followers.
Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense.
Yeah, no one needed
no other nation ended slavery.
Yeah, they're probably like, why would we get rid of this economically advantageous institution that just helps us move forward in the world? No need to defend it because everyone's doing it, right? And it just seems like a normality. And really, it was a normality. Slavery was probably the normality of human history for a long period of time. It was just a normality, right? I figure if you start humanity all over again, the same thing is going to happen. Don't know which groups are going to slave who, but someone's going to, the ones that just don't get the furthest or the strongest ones are going to take over the weaker ones at all times. That's always going to happen. It seems like it's just inevitable, right?
The United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes.
I want to make another point. And some people think it's like a superior race took over another superior race. I mean, you could kind of say that in some kind of weird sense, but not superior in some kind of like, I'm a better human. Like, it's kind of like you play Command and Conquer. I don't know if you play any of those Age of Empire games. Whoever comes, the faster you advance, the quicker you can go take over somebody. Not every person in the world, you got to have that unique individual who comes up with that thing you need, right? Happen to be some of those unique individuals were in Europe, right? And they were, not only were they in Europe, they were discovered to have the knowledge to advance their technology. Those people probably existed everywhere, but never got the resources or were discovered or got to use their talents because of certain other circumstances. And it's sort of like luck of the draw too. Like those guys, because it's not many individuals that raise a nation. It's a few that move nations forward, right?
Over the
And
century,
then, my bad, one more point. And then, you know, the further you get, the easier it becomes to innovate even more, because now you have access to more stuff. Once the one person or the couple of people discover electricity, they pass that knowledge on, and it was easier to make more things out of electricity, right? If that's clear to you guys, right? It's just the logical way advancement works. It's a fucking snowball.
as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation states with their own armies and navies. Raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, man.
By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps,
they were definitely geographically handicapped. Everyone knows that. Look at the map, especially, man. It was, you know, the wrong position, right?
one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Well, guys, that was that. That was some pretty good information. Yeah, like I said, I love learning about history, and I know little, right? Even that I would have to compare and contrast to other stories. The things that were obviously logically sound, in my opinion, you don't have to compare and contrast. But things that were mentioned, you know, like, you know, what they went through on the voyages and how many people were lost and stuff like that, that's still sort of logically sound, but you know what I mean? You got to compare and contrast other information. So, but good video, man. Haven't seen too much Thomas Sowell's work. That wasn't him speaking though, so I don't know. Did he make this video or produce, you know, the information about this? But yeah, great video. I definitely will be checking out more of Thomas Sowell's stuff. I'm gonna do a lot of history here, important stuff, right? So I can learn more because I want to be involved in the conversation. And when you're talking about anything important, especially today's day and age, when you talk about systemic racism and all sorts of rights for people and stuff like that, you kind of need to have context. And without context and you could be drawing the wrong conclusions, right? Like, which I can kind of see people doing all the time, right? But yeah, that's it, guys. Appreciate you watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'm out.